Good afternoon. My name is Tom Beaker, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture series held every third Thursday of the month here at the Museum of Nebraska History. A detailed schedule of this series, as well as information about all of our programs and services, can be found on the Society's website, www.nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society's Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Don Schaufelberger. Although Don grew up in southeast Nebraska, he did experience life without electricity when he went on visits to his uncle's farm near Nelson, Nebraska. During World War II, Don served in the United States Navy, where he received training in electronics. After the war, he received a degree in electrical engineering from the University of Nebraska. In 1949, started work with Consumers Public Power District at Beatrice. And then he moved to Columbus in 1949, and he still resides with his wife in Columbus today. He retired in June 1989 as Nebraska Public Power's president and CEO. Incidentally, last night, Don was inducted into the Columbus Area Business Hall of Fame. And at that, Don is going to talk to us today about the history of rural electric development in the state.
Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you folks about my favorite subject, public power in Nebraska. And before discussing the history of public power in Nebraska, I should sort of explain what I mean by public power in this discussion. Public power is those electric utilities like municipals, rural districts, and public power districts and federal agencies directly accountable to people they serve rather than as contrasted to an investor-owned company who are accountable to stockholders. The public power utilities are not for profit, while investor-owned companies are for profit. And Nebraska public power districts have local control of the people who they serve rather than stockholders spread out all over the United States. Nebraska has the distinction of having the only unicameral legislature, but likewise, they are the only state where all of the public power entities are publicly owned, and there are no longer any investor-owned companies serving customers in the state. The recently published book of the only state, and Tom has already mentioned that it is available. It chronicles the state's public utilities, or all utilities, from the beginning of Nebraska with no electricity. And this is Omaha before electricity in the 1800s. We'll move on just a little bit, and we look at how difficult it was. And I'm particularly fond of those two hands. They really show how tough living was in Nebraska before there was electricity. And yeah, I jumped a little bit further than I had intended to in the struggles. The first book on the history of public power in Nebraska, that comprehensive book, was written by Robert Firth and published in 1961. And there have been tremendous changes that needed to be documented in a history that would be available on down the road. And the first 345 kV line in the state hadn't been built yet by OPPD, and the Hallam nuclear power plant wasn't yet in operation in 1961. There was no Nebraska Public Power District, and there was no Lincoln Electric system at that time. So there's been a great deal of change over the years, as I say, needed to be documented. A bit more about my history. I grew up in southeast Lincoln, and competition between utilities didn't mean a thing to me. I knew my folks had the choice of power from either Iowa, Nebraska Light and Power or the City Light Department. They chose the first one. Now, after a severe lightning and thunderstorm, and if you remember in 1936, well, many of you don't remember 1936, we didn't have rain in those days. What we had is dust storms and grasshopper storms. But anyway, after one of those lightning storms, we quite often had light, and the people who were served by the city light department, lights were out. And as an engineer, I could tell you all the reasons why, except that it just happened. I would occasionally spend time, as Tom mentioned, on my uncle's farm near Nelson, and things were sort of tough. Now, that isn't my uncle and aunt and his children, but it sort of typifies what existed in those days before the rural areas got electricity. After 2 years in the Navy, during World War II, I went to school, as he mentioned, in UNL, and I went to work in Beatrice. Now, the equipment we had for building lines was really rather ancient in those days as compared to today. We weren't quite that old, but we were darn near it in replacing streetlight bulbs in the Beatrice district. Before I learned to climb, now the district thought I should have a lot of experience in things like being a lineman, so that's where I started to work at first. The line foreman told me I dug the lousiest holes he'd ever seen in his life, and I had to tamp all the dirt back in after the pole was set. I was transferred to Lincoln, and to set up a system planning department, and the computers we were using at that time were analog. It took close to a day to set up one study and complete it. Today, with your digital computers, they can be done in a split second, that same study. And even better, those complete transmission and generation and switchyard systems are all on computers in the dispatch center, so they can watch it almost instantaneously, what is happening, if a line goes out, where the loads are increasing that might cause a line to trip. So we've come a long, long ways. For years, I'd been gathering large quantities of resource material that might be used in a book, like NPPD. Most utilities were going through a paper reduction plan. There was no reason for keeping billings that were 40 years old. Who really cared what was used then? But the problem was the people that were assigned to the task were usually people who didn't know anything about keeping things for history. So they just willy-nilly threw stuff away. I have to tell you one example about a picture of FDR over at the Loop District, autographed and everything. The person that was doing the sorting tossed it in the disposal box. And along came an employee and saw that and said, "Hey, I'm going to take that because I know a fellow who just despises FDR, and I'm going to send it to him as a joke." Well, things happened years later when Loop was having their 75th anniversary. A young lady came in with that picture to return it to them, said her grandfather had that picture but never threw it away. So now the picture with the autograph and everything hangs in the lobby of the Loop Power District in Columbus. There were so many other things that were thrown away that I was a great scavenger. I ended up with about 24 banker boxes and 23-inch binders of material because someday I thought I might like to write a history. There was a lot of other historical information put on microfilm, but the systems for microfilming in those days weren't very good, and they'd just as well been buried because you can't find anything anyway. The book is well illustrated. I like to brag about it, but my wife says that if you don't want to read the book, just look at the pictures. They'll tell you a lot of history. Many people thought that the power industry in the United States started when Edison invented the successful incandescent light bulb. Well, that isn't true. There had been a lot of other things going on before that was accomplished. Many Nebraskans think that public power in Nebraska started with the development of irrigation and power districts in the 30s. Small dams on the rivers and streams in Nebraska were providing water power for milling of grain and sawmills and so forth long before electricity arrived in Nebraska. And for example, there was a cotton mill west of Kearney that operated for 4 or 5 years. It was a huge operation, and they turned the looms with water power in a canal, taking water out of the Platte River. But water in the Platte River was so undependable that they also had a steam plant to turn the looms if necessary. Even before Edison invented his successful light bulb, electricity was being used to replace steam engines supplying power in factories. In addition, electricity was being used for arc lights to replace gas and coal lamps on the streets of many cities. Well, those lights were almost as a curiosity rather than good street lighting that we know today. A great deal of credit was given to Edison for his inventions, but most people know very little about Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla was educated in Europe, came to the United States with little more than a few dollars in his pockets and a letter of introduction to Edison. He started working for Edison, and he worked for him for several years, doing some really fine work in advancing the things that Edison was producing. But he and Edison were constantly crossed swords because he believed in alternating current as the eventual big use of electricity, and Edison was dedicated to the direct current systems. Now, so Edison eventually fired Tesla, and Tesla had to eat, so he was working as a ditch digger in New York when he was introduced by a friend to George Westinghouse. Well, George Westinghouse liked that idea of alternating current and why Tesla said it was so good. At the New York World's Fair, Tesla's alternating current system was used, and that led to the building of the hydro plants at Niagara Falls and a transmission line to Buffalo. Well, the war was on between Edison and Tesla actually with Westinghouse, over DC or AC. And Edison's idea was that we'd have these little power plants about every 8 or 9 blocks in every city. And can you imagine how that would have worked in present day populations? And Tesla knew that with AC you could increase the voltage, transmit it, reduce it again, and then utilize it, and you could cover great distances, which DC couldn't do. That's not to say that DC doesn't cover great distances today, but now they know how to do it. Much of the early generation in Nebraska was from dynamos producing direct current. Kearney claims the first electric streetcar in Nebraska. Now, most of you being from Lincoln know about Jim McKee, who writes in the Lincoln Journal every week. And Jim contacted me and said, "Don, I think you're wrong. I don't think the first one. It's got to be in Lincoln or Omaha." And I said, "Why did you think I used the word purported to have the first one?" Boy, I was covering myself. He agreed that that was okay then. The first municipal electric system in Nebraska is also purported to be the city of Crete. Now, I've often wondered whether that's really correct, because what about these municipals who put in a dynamo and arc lights to light streets? Weren't they in municipal systems, and shouldn't they have been first? But we'll accept, because in general everybody accepts Crete as being the first one. But before Crete started their first municipal power plant, they went to Columbus, Nebraska, and on the south side of Columbus there was a small power plant serving about 30 customers to see how the thing worked and learn how to use one. Crete also purchased power from the Crete mills after the Crete mills converted their hydro plants to electric to power their mill. Many other small hydro plants were being converted from water power to electric power production, and surplus energy was being sold to residences and businesses near the power plant. And some of my favorites is this plant in Wilbur. That's the original plant when it was just water power of the Axmit and Zwanacheks. And the interior is down in the corner there of that plant. And when they converted it to electricity, and of course I had to put one of the pictures of the sale of flour in check. But like all mills and power plants, particularly the flour mills like this one in Wilbur and the one in sister one down in DeWitt, they succumbed to big mills like the Gooch Mill and the Crete mills, and who are just took over. They could do it far more efficient than those small milling companies could do. And also many of the small dams failed. The equipment failed. It was too expensive to replace it. And then Mother Nature started taking the dams out with floods and so forth. Steam and some gas and oil engines driven generation facilities began to be installed by entrepreneurs, in some cases by municipalities. Many of these operated only in the daytime hours and shut down at night. Many utilities up until the early 1960s peaked on Monday because that was wash day. And then it peaked again a little less on Tuesday because that was ironing day. Now with our modern washers and dryers, we work I guess 24/7. But also the utilities in that era, clear up into the 60s, had a winter peak load. But then along came air conditioning and irrigation, and Nebraska changed from a winter peaking utility to a summer peaking utilities. And this is an old plant in Scottsbluff, one of the early plants, and that has quite a history in it. But there's a lot of interesting stories how steam engines for thrashing machines were brought into town to serve as the driving force for the generator when the local turbine failed. In Scottsbluff, it was reported that a mob was going to lynch the power plant operator because he ran out of coal and didn't know when he was going to get any. So even then, they were starting to understand the importance of reliability of electric systems. Generation and distribution facilities are very dollar intensive. And in the 20s, many municipals and even some of the entrepreneurs couldn't raise the money necessary to expand their plants to take care of the load. Well, that's where the investor-owned companies stepped in, and they offered money, and municipalities, particularly being a little bit short of money and always looking for a way to get some, saw an opportunity to sell their systems, and many of the systems were sold to these investor-owned companies. Then there were still some municipalities that were doing fairly well, and so they wanted to sell their excesses, but the powerful investor-owned company lobbyists managed to convince the legislature to pass laws that municipals couldn't extend their system more than a few miles outside of their corporate limits. That took care of those possible competitors. Transmission lines were long string beam things, and I recall when I started working in Beatrice, The loads from Beatrice all the way to York could be carried from Beatrice on a number 2 copper 34.5 kV line. Or it could be from Beatrice all the way to Humboldt. The same thing. They could carry all the load of the intervening towns clear to Humboldt and some on beyond Dawson, Burden, and some others. They could carry those too. Well, now, for a comparison, a number 2 copper line, the conductor is about the size of a pencil, a wood pencil. But today, those 345,000 volt lines you see crossing the state, they have 2 conductors per phase, a little over an inch in diameter. They can carry 100 times as much power as that old 34.5 line can carry. And they're necessary because of the load growth. I recall being sent to Humboldt to help replace coils in one of the generators there in the old Cooper Mill. Consumers Public Power District had acquired the power plant in the Cooper Mill and operated it there in the mill. Well, they didn't teach me in university anything about replacing coils in a generator, so the most I did was smear varnish on the coils after they were installed. That was, but it was something else that was exciting, and that was lighting the boiler. It was a gas-fired boiler, and the way the manager lit the boiler was to turn on the gas to the boiler, walk over and pick up a stick and wrap a rag around it, dunk in a can of oil, then light it and flip it into the boiler. Kaboom! Now, there was one scared engineer when that happened. And then, of course, there wasn't an OSHA around to see that we did things safely. So that same gentleman, when the coreless engine was stuck on dead center, he straddles the big belt between the coreless engine and the generator and starts tugging on it till it starts moving, and before it picked up much speed, he managed to get off of it again. Now, think about those kind of things. I saw a lot of other things. OSHA would have gone bananas if they'd have known we were doing them. Well, I want to tell you a little story because within this book there's a number of sidebars, but I think this one is rather funny when I'm talking about the Humboldt power plant. Now, Guy Cooper tells this story, and Guy Cooper Jr. and Guy Cooper Sr. were on the Consumers Board of Directors, and so I got to know them fairly well. But anyway, Guy Cooper tells a story of how his grandfather was dying. But a few weeks prior to this incident, the mill and the power plant burnt down completely, and they were serving the city of Humboldt. Well, the mayor and some councilmen came to see Grandpa, and they wanted him to rebuild the power plant so they could have power again. And he said, well, you don't really think much of me and what all I've done for the city because you've been considering giving the right to serve Humboldt to some other company. And so I think I'll just take my money and go on my way. Well, they were really worried about this, and they said, well, now, if we write a new franchise immediately, will you reconsider? And he said, with tears in his eyes, well, I might do that. I'll think about it anyway. And so they dashed downtown to get a new thing written. And after they'd left to do this, Grandpa sniffed back his tears and was ready to rebuild the plant. But Guy Jr. said, Grandpa, how could you tell them that when you know you've already let the contract for rebuilding the power plant? He said, because I knew and they didn't know. So anyway, he died a couple weeks later, a happy man. And as long as I'm on sidebars in the book, I have another one that I like very much, and that's about Johnny Carson. I don't know how many of you know that Johnny Carson's dad worked for the Iowa Nebraska Light and Power and eventually Consumers Public Power District, and he was my boss for many years. That is Johnny's dad. But anyway, along about 1969, Johnny didn't know the impact that his show that night in December 1969 would have on utilities clear across the nation. Those of you that remember Tiny Tim and Miss Vicky and how Johnny hyped those up till they got to the point where they were going to get married on his show, well, 58 million people were watching that show that night. And once Tiny Tim and Miss Vicky were married and were leaving the show, everybody simultaneously turned off their TVs, turned out their lights to go to bed. Well, that's the lowest period of time for load on generators, and they all started to overspeed clear across the country. And Dale Asmuth, chief dispatcher for the Nebraska Public Power System, documented this in his daily report of how they almost lost the system of having it go down because of the sudden loss of load. But eventually they were able to correct that. In the 1930s, I should have had that a little earlier when I mentioned how the load changed to summer peaks with the irrigation. I think that's a rather pretty sight, and when you fly over those center pivots out in western Nebraska, they really make a very pretty picture as you go over them. In the 1930s, two things catapulted public utility ownership in Nebraska: the Great Depression and the historic drought conditions. The historic drought conditions resurrected several plans for irrigation, some as old as the 1800s. Some of these were great ideas, but faltered when rains came or the source of money dried up. The Great Depression brought on the need for jobs, and Nebraska recognized resurrecting the old irrigation projects and constructing them would create jobs. Then money became available through the PWA as loans and grants. So the three major hydro districts were again started, and that's the Platte Valley Public Power and Irrigation District, the Central Nebraska Public Power and Irrigation District, and the Loup River Public Power District. They brought a lot of jobs to the state. What made these projects viable, though, where in the past they hadn't been, was the generation cash register. Selling the energy that they produced would repay the loans. But, oops, who's going to buy the power and energy? The investor-owned companies had no desire to buy that power and energy, even if it could be purchased at lower than their generation costs. Faced with a possible default on their loans, the Loop District came up with the idea to create a separate district, Consumers Public Power District, to purchase investor-owned company facilities and then purchase its energy needs from the three hydro districts. The first purchase was the electric facilities of the Northwestern Public Service Company in and around Columbus. The purchase of other investor-owned company properties was facilitated by federal legislation requiring the breakup of holding companies. Now, the Nebraska employees, I found this letter over in files in York, and it was a letter from the president of the old Nebraska, Iowa-Nebraska Light and Power Company, in which he said their facilities would never be sold. He said that we'll still be operating here when those hydro lakes fill up with silt and their canals fill up with tumbleweeds. 1 month later, they sold their properties to Consumers Public Power District. Of course, no employees lost their jobs, so that wasn't really bad. Early on, Consumers District had a philosophy of divesting themselves of some of the properties they purchased. In so doing, a number of municipalities were created, including Sidney, North Platte, Grand Island, and Nebraska City, naming just a few. Initially, these municipalities purchased most of their energy requirements from either Consumers or the hydro districts. Consumers later changed their mind about this because it became apparent if they gave away the most revenue-producing facilities, they'd be left with nothing but a whole bunch of small towns and long transmission lines to get to them, to serve them, and the rates would have to go up. And this was not a good situation if they were going to pay off their bonds. So they began to oppose any efforts to take over the systems of consumers. Scotts Bluff put the issue on, and some other municipalities put the issue on the ballot, and in all cases they failed. People liked who was serving them, though I don't think quite often they really didn't know who was serving them, whether it was the old Western pub or whether it was consumers. All they knew, they flipped the switch and the lights came on. So they voted to keep what they had. Both consumers and Loop District were negotiating the purchase of the Nebraska Power Company serving Omaha and other communities in southeast Nebraska. Now, the business community of Omaha looked very unkind on having their country cousins out in Columbus operating their system in Omaha. So they began a very strong effort to acquire the system, and the whole struggle that they had in legislation and so forth, where they could finally accomplish this. But nonetheless, when you look back at the story, Loop District actually bought the Nebraska Power Company and resold it to what became the Omaha Public Power District. There was a couple of other very small purchases later in the 40s, which finally completed the sale and acquisition of all investor-owned companies in Nebraska. Some sold to rural districts, some sold to others. Another development that was the wonderful electric building that consumers acquired in Columbus, known as the electric company. Again, people didn't really care it was Northwestern Public Service or Consumers Public Power District. That's where they went to pay their bill. And there's the original Nebraska Power Company, and in later years, the Omaha Public Power District. And it's still the general office for Omaha Public Power District. Another development during the Great Depression was the creation of the Rural Electric Administration. And numerous farmer groups got together in the mid-late 30s to create rural districts and apply for RA finance loans. County agents had a great deal to do with spearheading the effort to organize a rural cooperative, but pledges by the farmers of $3 to $5 a month minimum bill was a difficult decision to make during the Depression and drought conditions. Many farmers helped. In this picture, it's Franklin Roosevelt signing the bill for the Rural Electrification Act. Many farmers helped with construction by digging holes for poles to earn money or to expedite service to their farmstead. A farmer in Stanton County earned the nickname of the human gopher in recognition that he could dig a hole in 20 minutes or less. I defy him to do that if he was digging down in Richardson County with that rocky soil. Most of the rural facilities and rural district growth was at a standstill during World War II, but it took up again right after the war as soon as manpower and materials became available. Over the next 10 to 15 years, most of Nebraska rural areas were electrified. One would think, since all electric utilities in Nebraska were publicly owned, there would be little or no strife between the various types of entities since they are all publicly owned. Well, that's just another part, just as in other parts of the United States, municipalities encroached into the rural areas' territory, and rurals were encroaching into the municipalities' corporate area, and so there was constant battles going on. With the creation of the Nebraska Power Review Board by the legislature, most of these conflicts were eliminated because we entered into what was known as service areas in which you had the right to serve. And that was they were approved by the Power Review Board. A bigger conflict resulted when the hydro districts customers of the hydro districts became dissatisfied with the rates and so forth of the wholesale power received from the hydro districts. The conflict was further intensified when Consumers Public Power District decided to construct generation and buy power directly from the Bureau of Reclamation, from the mainstream dams up in the Dakotas and Montana. Recognizing that there was lengthy litigation went on over that, and eventually the legislature passed a bill for forcing the merger of the 3 hydro districts and consumers. Well, it really didn't include the Central District because they'd backed off a long time ago and were sticking strictly to their irrigation operations and leased all of their facilities to the Nebraska Public Power System. Well, this bill that was passed to force the merger was declared unconstitutional, but Loop and consumers recognized that they'd just be back with another bill that would probably be more onerous than the one that was declared unconstitutional. So they worked out an agreement for a separation of properties where consumers took over all of the high voltage lines and facilities of Loop outside of a 4-county area around Columbus, and the Loop District took over all of consumers' distribution systems and subtransmission within that 4-county area. And with that, consumers became the partner in the Nebraska Public Power System. Get mixed up on all these names, they get so long. Anyway, the Platte District wanted nothing to do with that realignment, but the consumers and the Platte District's philosophies of operating the Nebraska Public Power System were so similar that it wasn't long when they were able to work out a voluntary merger, which took effect in 1970 and formed Nebraska Public Power District. Businessmen in Lincoln felt they were losing out on industrial development because OPPD had so much better industrial rates than Lincoln had. Consumers served about 75% of the residential load in Lincoln and virtually all of the industrial load. And they thought if they could acquire consumers' properties, they could adjust the rates so they'd have industrial rates competitive with OPPD. So legislation managed to get through that consumers had to divest themselves of their distribution properties in Lincoln and a couple towns near Lincoln. Well, it didn't work out quite the way Lincoln thought it would, because the minute they wanted to lower rates to the industrial customers, where do you think that other revenue was going to come from? From the other businesses and the residences, and they were none too happy about that, and they had a lot of more votes for the mayor and city council than a few industries had. So they never quite achieved having that thing they really went after. The Eastern Nebraska Rural Public Power District merged with OPPD, which benefited both entities. OPPD with better utilization of their facilities and eliminating competition in the rural areas, and the rural customers receiving lower rates. At a later date, Norris Public Power District and OPPD started studying a possible merger. Now this really upset Lincoln also, because now they would have, since Norris completely surrounds Lincoln with their properties, they would now have OPPD completely surrounding Lincoln with their lower industrial rates. Well, the merger negotiations ended when OPPD suddenly discovered that they were exempted from many bills that have been, many statutes, because there was always this thing that if you didn't operate in more than 13 counties, they didn't apply to you. And if they took over Norris, they'd suddenly have a lot more than 13 counties that they were operating in, and they would be subject to those statutes, which they didn't like at all. Other mergers have been studied, and even though in many cases the study showed there could have been significant savings, Loop and Cornhusker District studied merging. And it's true that there would have been some savings through combined operation, but Cornhusker finally withdrew, and their reasoning was that farmers aren't always the best voters. And they were worried, Loop having all of these towns that they served, that it wouldn't be long and all the board members of the Loop district would be from towns rather from the rural areas. Because as a rural district, all of their board members were farmers. So they decided that that might not be a good thing in the long run if the board of directors of Loop were all city folk and would not think about the problems of the farmers. And there was others that had similar problems that they worried, well, what's going to happen to our general manager when he's absorbed by NPPD? What kind of a job will he get? They already have a general manager, so he sure isn't going to get that. Well, I forgot to show you the picture of when the merger occurred, the three entities that formed NPPD. And then we have the Lincoln Electric system, and they have a rather unique, in the upper left-hand corner is a combustion turbine site in near Rokeby. And it's interesting from the standpoint, it got a lot of acclaim around the country because they make ice, and then to increase the capability of their combustion turbine, they run the air through that ice and cool it down, and they can get more efficiency out of the combustion turbine. And it's one of few in the whole country. There were still occasional bumps in the road, and the various public power entities in the state fight each other occasionally. But for the most part, these are resolved, and they're being overshadowed in the last 2 decades by the increase of industrial, environmental issues, the cost of fuel and freight, and the devastating storms impacting the rates of. And so there's been seems like almost an annual rate increase for about the last 10 years. Nonetheless, they still have some of the, and there's the lease term. It costs us a lot of money to protect those. And I know there's one in the audience that wouldn't like me to say that I wish the people on the Oregon Trail and the Mormon Trail would have eaten all of those, and we wouldn't have to spend all that money. But at any rate, they're good to have around. We have to keep those things. But, and the storms. Very devastating, whether it's a tornado, even some of the floods, or ice storms. And they've taken down a lot of things. On the bright side, though, the public power entities in Nebraska have done a magnificent job in providing reliable electric service at a cost consistently below most other utilities in the United States. Public power has contributed to and will continue to contribute to the good life in Nebraska. And I like this, that the flowering trees in the spring are as dependable as Nebraska public power. These are the trees that Norm and I planted in front of the general office building in Columbus, in grateful appreciation for the great career I had with Nebraska Public Power District and public power in general in Nebraska. I thank you for the opportunity to bring this story to you, and would be glad to answer any questions if you have any.